The men climbing Hill 937 were soaked, exhausted, and already bleeding before the real fighting even started. The jungle was so thick it swallowed sound, visibility, and any sense of scale. You could be 10 feet from the enemy and never see him. What you did see were the wounded coming back down the slope, sometimes walking, sometimes carried, sometimes not moving at all. They attacked the same hill again and again. Each time, the hill took more of them. By the time it was over, Hill 937 had a new name, one that said everything the official reports would not. And when the fighting finally stopped, the question wasn't who won. It was why it happened at all. Hill 937 sat in the western reaches of South Vietnam, near the Laotian border, inside the A Shau Valley. On paper, it was just a contour line on a military map. In reality, it was a slab of jungle-covered terrain rising steeply out of one of the most unforgiving landscapes American forces had encountered in the war. The A Shau Valley was long, narrow, and almost permanently hostile. Steep ridgelines boxed it in on both sides, funneling movement along predictable paths while offering defenders high ground and concealment. Triple canopy jungle choked the valley floor and the hills alike, limiting visibility to a few yards and turning every movement into a physical struggle. Rain was frequent, mud was constant, nothing stayed dry for long, not clothing, not weapons, not morale. Hill 937 itself rose to just over 3,000 feet. That elevation number is where its name came from, not from any inherent importance attached to the terrain. It was not a crossroads. It did not overlook a major population center. There was no airfield, no supply depot, no village at its base. It was simply one hill among many, indistinguishable to anyone who hadn't been ordered to climb it. What made the hill dangerous was not its height, but its shape and cover. The slopes were steep enough to slow movement to a crawl, forcing attackers uphill while exposing them to fire from above. The jungle vegetation was thick enough to conceal defenders almost completely. Natural terrain features, ravines, folds in the ground, and natural fighting positions had been reinforced over time into an integrated defensive system. This was not accidental terrain. The North Vietnamese Army had been operating in the A Shau Valley for years. They understood it better than anyone flying over it ever could. Hill 937 had been prepared deliberately, with bunkers dug deep into the earth, connected by trench lines and protected by overhead cover. Many of these positions were invisible until they opened fire. For American planners, the valley mattered because it had long been identified as a logistical corridor. Units moved through it to rest, refit, and stage operations. The assumption was that clearing enemy forces from the area would disrupt those movements and deny the North Vietnamese a safe haven. The problem was that clearing meant different things to different people. From the air, the valley looked like terrain that could be dominated. Helicopters could insert troops, artillery could reach most points, air power could be brought to bear when contact was made. From the ground, it was something else entirely. Visibility collapsed, communications degraded, fire support became harder to coordinate. Small unit actions replaced grand plans. Hill 937 became important not because it controlled the valley, but because it was occupied. Enemy forces were there in strength, and once contact was made, disengaging was no longer simple. Each attempt to probe the hill revealed more resistance, more fortifications, more reason, at least on paper, to press the attack. By the time the first American units began pushing up its slopes in May of 1969, Hill 937 had already done its most important work. It had erased the distinction between a map objective and a human one. From that point forward, the hill was no longer just terrain. It was a fight that had started, and one that would not be easily stopped. By the spring of 1969, the Vietnam War was no longer being fought the way it had been just a few years earlier. The massive search and destroy sweeps of the mid-1960s had proven costly, politically toxic, and strategically inconclusive. In their place, the U.S. military was attempting something more measured, at least in theory. That shift was tied closely to the arrival of Creighton Abrams as commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. Abrams inherited a war that had already fractured public trust at home and morale in the field. His approach emphasized smaller units, sustained pressure, and the disruption of enemy operations rather than large, single-objective offenses meant to produce dramatic body counts. But doctrine changes on paper did not erase habits built over years of fighting. Metrics still mattered, contact still mattered, and once contact was made, disengagement was rarely encouraged unless there was a clear reason to pull back. Operations were increasingly framed around denying the enemy freedom of movement rather than holding ground permanently. Hills were taken not because they were meant to be occupied forever, but because enemy forces were using them. The assumption was that if those forces were found and destroyed, the objective had been met, even if the terrain itself was later abandoned. This approach created a quiet contradiction. Tactical units were expected to aggressively engage and defeat enemy formations wherever they were found. Strategically, those victories were not always meant to be visibly retained. The logic made sense in staff briefings. On the ground, it was far harder to reconcile. Hill 937 fell directly into that contradiction. When American units entered the Ashaw Valley in May of 1969, they were not looking for a symbolic fight. They were conducting a routine operation aimed at locating and disrupting North Vietnamese units believed to be using the area as a base. The assumption was that contact would be sharp but manageable, followed by withdrawal once resistance collapsed. Instead, resistance hardened. Once the first engagements revealed that Hill 937 was heavily defended, the logic of the war took over. Enemy units had been found. They were dug in. Leaving them in place meant accepting that the valley would continue to function as a staging area. Pressing the attack became, in institutional terms, the correct response. At no point was Hill 937 designated as a must-hold objective in the traditional sense. It was never presented as terrain that would change the course of the war by its capture alone. But neither was it treated as optional once casualties began to mount. Each assault that failed increased the pressure to succeed, not withdraw. Each loss demanded justification through progress. This is where the war's strategic ambiguity began operational reality. Units were committed incrementally. Companies rotated in and out of the same ground. The objective subtly shifted from locating the enemy to defeating him decisively, on that hill, in that place, regardless of how many attempts it took. Hamburger Hill did not represent a return to old doctrine, nor a clean execution of the new one. It was something in between. A battle fought under strategy that said terrain did not matter, until it suddenly did, because the enemy was standing on it. And once that line was crossed, the hill was no longer just another position in the jungle. It was the place where the war's internal logic would collide with its public consequences. The primary American force committed to the fight for Hill 937 came from the 101st Airborne Division, an air mobile unit built around speed, helicopter mobility, and aggressive small unit action. By 1969, the division had already spent years operating in Vietnam. The men who would climb the hill were not inexperienced replacements stumbling into their first fight. Most had already seen combat. Many had already lost friends. The battalions involved belonged to the 3rd Brigade of the 101st, operating under orders that emphasized rapid movement, aggressive contact, and constant pressure on enemy forces. Companies were inserted by helicopter into landing zones carved out of jungle where possible, or dropped as close as terrain allowed. From there, everything happened on foot. The soldiers carried heavy loads, rifles, ammunition, radios, water, rations, grenades, while hacking their way uphill through vegetation that fought every step. The terrain erased formations almost immediately. Squads lost visual contact with one another. Platoons advanced in fragments, connected more by radio than by sight. Opposing them were elements of the North Vietnamese Army's 29th Regiment, a unit well versed in fighting on terrain like this. These were not fleeting guerrilla forces passing through the valley. They were established, disciplined troops operating from prepared positions. They had time, familiarity, and the advantage of defense. The NVA had transformed the hill into a layered system. Bunkers were dug deep into the slopes, reinforced with timber and earth, and positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Trench lines connected positions, allowing movement under cover. Firing ports were narrow, concealed, and often impossible to spot until they opened up. Many bunkers were resistant to artillery fragments and could survive airstrikes that looked devastating from above, but did little to neutralize defenders below ground. For American troops, this erased the usual assumptions about firepower. Artillery could soften suspected positions, but rarely eliminate them. Airstrikes could shake the jungle, strip foliage, and crater the slopes, yet defenders often re-emerged once the noise stopped. Progress still had to be made by men moving uphill, one position at a time. Leadership at the company and platoon level mattered enormously. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers made decisions measured in seconds, whether to push forward, pull back, flank, or call for fire. These decisions were often made with incomplete information, broken lines of sight, and radios that struggled in the terrain. When units stalled, they stalled in place, exposed and under fire. Casualties accumulated unevenly. One platoon might be hit hard while another moved a few yards without contact. A company could lose momentum in minutes, then spend hours trying to extract wounded under fire. Medevac helicopters were lifelines, but landing zones were scarce and often contested. Sometimes the wounded had to be carried downhill by hand, step by painful step. The men on both sides understood what this kind of fight meant. For the defenders, time favored them. Every failed assault wore down the attackers. For the Americans, pressure ran the other way. Once committed, pulling out without success felt less like maneuver and more like defeat. By the time multiple battalions were cycling through the slopes of Hill 937, the battle was no longer defined by orders issued far above the jungle canopy. It was defined by small groups of men fighting for ground measured in yards, not maps. And that was when the hill began to demand its price. Operation Apache Snow began on May 10, 1969. The initial movements into the Ashaw Valley were routine by the standards of the war. Air mobile insertions, patrols along ridgelines, and deliberate pushes into terrain believed to be lightly occupied. What followed would prove otherwise. By May 11th, and increasingly over the next 2 days, American units began encountering resistance centered on Hill 937. Early contact was sharp and immediate. Small arms fire erupted at close range, often from positions that were completely invisible until they opened fire. What had been expected to be fleeting engagements turned into sustained firefights almost as soon as movement uphill began. Helicopters inserted companies into limited landing zones where the terrain allowed. From there, progress was on foot, uphill and slow. Dense jungle collapsed spacing almost immediately. Squads lost visual contact with one another. Platoons advanced in fragments, connected more by radio than by sight, when radios worked at all. The first exchanges made one thing clear: the enemy was not probing, he was waiting. Automatic weapons pinned units in place from elevated positions. Fire came from above, from the flanks, from the angles that suggested coordination rather than improvisation. Attempts to maneuver ran into the same problem again and again. The terrain offered few alternatives. Ravines and vegetation funneled movement into predictable routes. Every effort to flank revealed another firing position. American commanders responded with the tools available to them. Artillery was called in on suspected bunker complexes. Airstrikes were requested to suppress resistance and clear vegetation. The hill shook, trees splintered, the jungle burned and collapsed in places. When the fire lifted, resistance remained. The first day of focused fighting ended without a breakthrough. Units had advanced only short distances at significant cost. Casualties were evacuated where possible, often under fire. In some cases, helicopters could not land close enough, and wounded men were carried downhill by hand while the fight continued above them. Renewed assaults followed over the next 2 days. Fresh companies were committed against the same slopes. They encountered defenders who were now fully alert, fully dug in, and fully prepared. The hill revealed more bunkers, more trench lines, and more depth than initial estimates had suggested. Communication became increasingly difficult as the fighting intensified. Dense jungle interfered with radios. Units lost contact with adjacent elements. Orders were relayed through static, repeated, clarified, and then executed with incomplete information. Progress was measured not by objectives reached, but by whether units were moving or pinned. By this point, it was clear that Hill 937 was not a temporary enemy position. It was a prepared stronghold, deliberately occupied and designed to be defended. American forces were no longer searching for the enemy. They had found him. With that realization came a shift in the operation's internal logic. Leaving the hill intact after taking casualties was no longer a neutral option. Pressing the attack meant committing fully to a fight that was proving far more costly than anticipated. The battle had crossed its point of easy disengagement. Hill 937 was no longer just terrain on a map. It was now a fight that demanded resolution, one way or the other. By the third day, the pattern was set. American units would move uphill, make limited gains, and then be stopped cold by fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. What changed was not the outcome of each assault, but the cost. Hill 937 was not defended by a single line or a handful of positions. It was a system. Bunkers were dug into the slopes at multiple elevations, each one covering approaches to the next. Trenches connected them, allowing defenders to move laterally and reinforce threatened points without exposing themselves. Overhead cover protected firing positions from shrapnel and blast. When one bunker was suppressed, another opened fire from a slightly different angle. The jungle amplified the effect. Vegetation limited visibility to just a few yards. Assaulting troops often could not see the source of incoming fire until it was already pinning them down. Even when a bunker was identified, it was rarely possible to engage it directly without closing to extremely short range. Grenades, satchel charges, and small arms fire became the only reliable tools, and all of them required men to move uphill and to fire to use them. Repeated assaults began to wear units down physically and psychologically. The climb alone was punishing. Soldiers slipped in mud, grabbed roots and vines to pull themselves forward, and fought for balance on slopes that offered little cover. Loads felt heavier with each attempt. Water ran low, weapons fouled with dirt and moisture. Fatigue compounded every decision. Casualties mounted in uneven bursts. A platoon might move for an hour without contact, only to take several hits in seconds when it crossed an unseen field of fire. Leaders were often exposed, moving forward to direct movement or identify positions. Medics followed close behind, sometimes working under fire for extended periods before evacuation was possible. Medevac helicopters became a constant presence when weather and enemy fire allowed. Landing zones were scarce and frequently contested. In many cases, wounded men had to be carried downhill by hand over the same ground that had just been fought over, while the fight continued above them. Time stretched. Minutes waiting for extraction felt like hours. Fire support was called in repeatedly. Artillery barrages crashed into the slopes. Airstrikes tore at the jungle canopy. Napalm burned away vegetation and oxygen alike. From above, it looked decisive. On the ground, it often was not. Bunkers survived, defenders reemerged. When American troops advanced again, resistance resumed as if little had changed. Each failed push added pressure to the next one. Commanders rotated companies in and out, hoping fresh troops could exploit ground already paid for. But terrain did not remember who had fought over it before. Every unit faced the same slopes, the same bunkers, and the same angles of fire. Friendly fire incidents became a risk as well. Dense jungle, limited visibility, and overlapping fields of fire made coordination difficult. Artillery and airstrikes had to be carefully timed and lifted. Any mistake carried immediate consequences for troops already dangerously close to the enemy. Despite this, there was no sense on the ground that the fight could simply be paused or abandoned. Enemy forces were engaged in strength. Leaving them intact felt unacceptable after so much effort and loss. Progress, however small, became its own justification. The defenders understood this dynamic. They did not need to counterattack aggressively. Their job was to hold, delay, and inflict casualties. Every assault that stalled worked in their favor. Time and terrain were allies. For the Americans, the hill began to feel endless. Gains were measured in yards, sometimes only in the distance between where a man had fallen and where the next assault began. Maps showed movement. Bodies told a different story. As days passed, exhaustion set in across units. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. Meals were irregular. The sound of incoming fire never entirely faded from memory, even during brief lulls. The hill became a constant presence, looming, resisting, and demanding more with every attempt. What had started as a search operation was now unmistakably a battle of attrition. The question was no longer whether Hill 937 could be taken. It was how much it would cost before it finally gave way. And the answer, slowly, painfully, was still coming. By the middle of the battle, Hill 937 had settled into a brutal rhythm. Assault, contact, casualties, withdrawal. Then another assault, often along the same routes, against the same unseen positions. Progress was no longer measured by objectives seized, but by whether units could move at all before being forced to stop. Companies were rotated in and out of the fights as they became depleted. Fresh troops were inserted with the hope that momentum could be regained, that a new push might finally crack the defenses. Instead, they inherited the same terrain, the same bunkers, and the same fields of fire that had stopped those before them. Experience offered little advantage when every approach was already known to the defenders. Commanders faced narrowing options. Disengaging would leave a heavily fortified enemy position intact in an area already identified as a sanctuary. Continuing meant committing more men to the same ground. Each decision was framed by the losses already taken. Once blood had been spent, the pressure to justify that cost through success intensified. Coordination became increasingly difficult. Dense jungle and broken terrain fractured units. Platoons lost contact with one another. Radio traffic increased, but clarity did not. Orders were relayed through static, repeated, clarified, then acted on with incomplete information. Small unit leaders were forced to improvise constantly, adjusting plans on the fly as terrain and fire dictated. Artillery and air support were used heavily, but their effectiveness plateaued. Known positions could be suppressed, but new ones revealed themselves only after troops moved again. Each barrage altered the landscape without solving the underlying problem. The defenders adapted, shifting positions, waiting out the explosions, and re-emerging when it was safe. Fatigue became a factor as decisive as enemy fire. Soldiers moved slower, reaction times dulled, mistakes crept in, weapons jammed more frequently under constant dirt and moisture. Simple tasks took longer. Leaders pushed men who were already at the edge of exhaustion because there was no one else to push. Casualties accumulated not in dramatic surges, but in steady increments. A man hit here, another there. Medics worked continuously, often under fire, stabilizing the wounded with limited supplies. Evacuation remained difficult. When helicopters could not land, the burden fell on fellow soldiers to carry the injured back down the slopes. The psychological toll deepened. Repeated exposure to the same killing ground wore down even experienced troops. The hill began to feel personal. It was no longer an abstract objective, but a place associated with loss. Each return to the slope meant passing spots where someone had fallen before. Enemy resistance showed no sign of collapse. Defensive fires remained disciplined and effective. The absence of large counterattacks did not signal weakness, it signaled confidence. The defenders did not need to chase, they only needed to hold. As the days dragged on, the battle's logic hardened. Momentum was something that had to be forced, not gained naturally. Units were committed because withdrawing felt worse than continuing. Each incremental gain narrowed the possibility of disengagement. The deeper the Americans went, the harder it became to justify stopping. By now, the battle had ceased to resemble a fluid operation. It was a test of endurance and will, fought in a space that seemed designed to strip both away. Every yard gained was paid for, and none of it felt decisive. Hill 937 was no longer resisting out of surprise or preparation alone. It was resisting because the terrain, the defenses, and the structure of the fight favored exactly this kind of grinding stalemate. And with each passing day, the cost of breaking it rose. By any conventional measure, American forces on Hill 937 possessed overwhelming firepower. Artillery was available, close air support was on call, helicopters moved men and supplies where roads could not. In another environment, that combination might have ended the fight quickly. On this hill, it did not. Artillery strikes were frequent and heavy. Guns fired from distant fire bases, walking barrages across suspected positions, and hammering ridgelines where resistance was believed to be strongest. The impacts were violent, shaking the ground and shredding vegetation. From above, the results looked decisive. From below, they often were not. The problem was not accuracy so much as effect. Many of the North Vietnamese bunkers were dug deep into the slopes, reinforced with timber and earth, and protected by overhead cover. Fragmentation could rake the surface, but it rarely penetrated far enough to neutralize defenders completely. When the barrage lifted, firing ports reopened. Movement resumed. The hill absorbed punishment and gave little back. Airstrikes faced similar limitations. Bombs and napalm could strip foliage, collapse shallow positions, and crater exposed areas. They could not reliably destroy bunkers that had been deliberately designed to survive exactly that kind of attack. In some cases, cleared vegetation actually improved fields of fire for defenders once they reoccupied their positions. Coordination added another layer of difficulty. Fire support had to be carefully timed and lifted before American troops moved forward. With units operating at close range and visibility measured in yards, the margin for error was thin. Strikes that landed too close risked friendly casualties. Strikes lifted too early gave defenders time to reset. Every adjustment carried risk. The terrain magnified those challenges. Steep slopes distorted blast effects. Dense jungle disrupted observation. Spotting enemy movement was difficult, even during bombardment. Battle damage assessment, knowing whether a position had actually been neutralized, was often impossible until troops advanced again and found out the hard way. As a result, firepower became a blunt instrument. It could suppress, it could disorient, it could create brief windows of opportunity. It could not solve the problem on its own. That left the final work to infantry. Each time an assault followed heavy fire, expectations rose. Surely this time the resistance would be broken. Instead, units moved forward into a landscape that looked devastated but remained lethal. Bunkers that appeared destroyed revealed intact firing positions. Trenches that seemed abandoned carried defenders to new points of contact. The psychological effect of this mismatch was profound. Firepower was supposed to simplify the fight. Instead, it raised hopes that were repeatedly dashed. Each failed breakthrough chipped away at confidence, not in courage or skill, but in the idea that there was a clean solution waiting just one more barrage away. The defenders understood this dynamic. They waited out the bombardments, conserving strength and ammunition. When the noise stopped, they resumed their task. Hold the ground, delay the advance, inflict casualties. Nothing more was required. For American commanders, the options narrowed further. More firepower risked diminishing returns and greater danger to friendly forces. Less firepower meant sending men forward against intact defenses. There was no combination that offered certainty. Hill 937 exposed a hard truth about the war being fought in Vietnam by 1969. Technology and firepower could dominate space, but they could not compel outcomes when the enemy was prepared to absorb punishment and remain in place. In the end, the hill would not be taken by explosions alone. It would be taken by men moving uphill, one position at a time, because there was no other way left. By May 20th, the battle had reached a point where ambiguity no longer existed. Hill 937 was either going to be taken or the operation would have to be reconsidered entirely. Too many units had been committed. Too many casualties had already been absorbed. Whatever flexibility might have existed at the beginning of Operation Apache Snow had been consumed by the fight itself. The final assault reflected hard-earned lessons. Piecemeal attacks had failed. Single-axis pushes had stalled. This time, multiple units advanced simultaneously, applying pressure from different directions to strain the defensive system rather than batter it from one approach alone. Fire support was coordinated with restraint rather than excess. Artillery and airstrikes targeted known bunker complexes and likely reinforcement routes, not with the expectation of total destruction, but to suppress defenders long enough for infantry to close the distance. Timing mattered more than volume. The objective was not to level the hill, but to create brief windows where movement was possible. When the assault began, progress was still slow and dangerous, but the balance began to shift. Defenders who had previously been able to concentrate fire on a single approach now faced pressure from multiple directions. Some bunkers were bypassed, others were engaged directly. Small unit leaders adapted on the move, exploiting gaps when they appeared and pushing forward when resistance weakened. The fighting remained brutal and intimate. Grenades were used repeatedly. Automatic weapons fired at close range. Individual positions were cleared only after direct contact, often at distances measured in feet. There was no sudden collapse, no rout. Resistance thinned unevenly as defenders fell back from position to position under mounting pressure. By the end of the day, American units reached the crest of Hill 937. The summit was not a single point, but a broken stretch of ground scarred by bombardment and fighting. Bunkers dotted the area. Some were empty, others were destroyed. A few still required clearing even after the hill was considered secured. Resistance faded not because every defender had been eliminated, but because holding the position no longer offered advantage. Casualty figures told the story the terrain did not. Over 10 days of fighting, American forces had suffered heavy losses, with dozens killed and hundreds wounded. North Vietnamese casualties were also severe, though exact numbers were difficult to confirm. Bodies were recovered, others were not. The jungle kept its accounting imprecise. For the men who finally stood on the hill, there was no sense of triumph. Exhaustion overwhelmed everything else. Relief came first, relief that the firing had stopped, that the immediate threat was gone. What followed was quieter and harder to define. The hill did not look like a prize. It did not reveal supply depots or command posts. It did not command sweeping views that explained the cost paid to reach it. It looked like what it was, ground that had consumed enormous effort and returned little that could be pointed to on a map. At no point had Hill 937 been intended as a permanent position. The objective had been to engage and attrit enemy forces operating in the A Shau Valley, not to establish a long-term foothold on isolated terrain. That reality was understood at higher levels, even as the fight itself demanded full commitment. The hill had been taken. What that meant, and what would be done next, was still unfolding. The battle for Hill 937 was over. The consequences of taking it were not. The decision to abandon Hill 937 was not made in a vacuum, nor was it unusual by the standards of the war being fought in Vietnam in 1969. U.S. forces were not there to hold terrain permanently unless it served a specific operational purpose. The objective had been to engage and attrit enemy units using the A Shau Valley as a base. Once that objective was deemed met, remaining on the hill offered little additional value. On June 5, 1969, U.S. forces abandoned Hill 937. On paper, the logic was sound. On the ground, it landed like a punch. For the men who had fought up Hill 937, the withdrawal felt abrupt even after the passage of time. Days of brutal fighting had been justified, implicitly, if not explicitly, by the idea that success meant taking the hill. When that success was followed weeks later by departure, the meaning of the entire battle was called into question. This disconnect between operational logic and human experience was not new. It had occurred before, and it would occur again. What made Hamburger Hill different was visibility. The battle had been costly, widely reported, and difficult to explain in simple terms. Leaving the hill after such an investment stripped away any remaining ambiguity. To the soldiers involved, it felt as though the ground itself had never truly mattered, only the act of fighting over it. That realization carried weight. It suggested that sacrifice was tied less to outcome than to momentum, less to victory than to a system that demanded continuation once engagement began. Commanders understood the frustration, but they also understood the constraints. Holding Hill 937 would have required additional forces to defend an isolated position in hostile terrain, tying down units needed elsewhere. From a strategic standpoint, remaining made little sense. From a moral standpoint, the calculus was far less comfortable. News of the withdrawal traveled quickly beyond the valley. Reporters already covering the battle seized on the contrast between the cost of taking the hill and the decision to leave it. The question practically wrote itself. Why fight so hard for something you did not intend to keep? That question resonated far beyond the Ashaw Valley. Within days, Hamburger Hill became more than a military engagement. It became a symbol, not of defeat in a tactical sense. The hill had been taken, but of a war whose objectives seemed increasingly disconnected from its methods. Comparisons were drawn to earlier conflicts, particularly the Korean War, where costly battles over isolated terrain had produced similar debates. For the public back home, the story was simple and damning. Young men had died for ground that was abandoned. Whether that framing captured the full complexity of the operation mattered less than the fact that it made sense emotionally. Inside the military, the reaction was more measured, but no less significant. Hamburger Hill became a reference point. It exposed the limits of attrition-based logic in a war increasingly scrutinized through a political lens. It forced uncomfortable conversations about how success was defined and how much ambiguity could be tolerated before credibility collapsed. For the soldiers who had been there, those debates offered little comfort. They carried the memory of the hill with them, not as a symbol, but as a place where friends were wounded or killed, a place that demanded everything and offered no explanation in return. Hill 937 did not need to be held to leave a mark. Walking away ensured that it would. The nickname Hamburger Hill did not come from a briefing room or a headline writer. It came from the men fighting on the slopes of Hill 937, and it carried a meaning that needed no explanation. The hill ground people up. Progress was measured in losses. Units were fed into the fight and came back reduced. The name stuck because it felt accurate. Once it reached the press, it became something else entirely. Reporters covering the battle quickly realized that Hill 937 was a story the public could grasp. It had a clear beginning, a clearly defined objective, visible suffering, and an ending that raised more questions than it answered. The nickname gave it emotional clarity. Hamburger Hill sounded wasteful. It sounded industrial. It sounded like something had gone wrong. Coverage emphasized the cost. Casualty figures were reported alongside descriptions of repeated assaults and brutal terrain. When news broke that the hill had been abandoned shortly after it was taken, the framing hardened. This was no longer just another battle in a long war. It was a symbol of futility. The comparison that surfaced most often was to Pork Chop Hill during the Korean War, another costly fight over terrain that carried more symbolic weight than strategic value. That parallel mattered because it suggested a pattern, not an anomaly. The implication was that the United States had learned this lesson before, and yet here it was again. Political reaction followed quickly. Members of Congress questioned the rationale behind such operations. Public statements reflected growing unease with the way the war was being fought and explained. The administration found itself responding not just to military outcomes, but to the perception that those outcomes were disconnected from any clear purpose. Inside the Pentagon, the attention was unwelcome but unavoidable. Hamburger Hill was discussed not because it represented a tactical failure. It did not, but because it exposed how thin the margin had become between military necessity and political acceptability. The same operation that could be justified internally now looked indefensible when stripped of context and presented to a skeptical public. The media did not invent that tension, it revealed it. For soldiers still in Vietnam, the coverage landed unevenly. Some felt that the reporting finally reflected what the fighting had actually been like, hard, grinding, and costly in ways that never seemed to translate into progress. Others felt that nuance had been lost, that the complexity of the operation had been flattened into a single narrative of waste. Both reactions could coexist because the battle itself supported them. Hamburger Hill became shorthand. It was referenced in debates about troop levels, operational strategy, and withdrawal timelines. It appeared in editorials and speeches as evidence that the war's internal logic no longer aligned with public tolerance. Even people who could not locate the Ashaw Valley on a map understood what the name implied. That was its power. Unlike statistics or map, the story of Hill 937 required no technical understanding. Men fought hard, men died, the ground was taken, then it was abandoned. Everything else, the doctrine, the strategy, the intent, felt like an explanation after the fact. By the time attention shifted elsewhere, the damage had already been done. Hamburger Hill had joined a growing list of moments that eroded trust, not because they were isolated failures, but because they made the war's contradictions visible. The hill itself disappeared back into the jungle. The name did not. And it ensured that Hill 937 would be remembered not for where it was, but for what it represented. A war struggling to justify the cost of how it was being fought. Hamburger Hill did not end the Vietnam War, but it accelerated a shift that was already underway. What it changed was not battlefield capability, but tolerance. How much ambiguity could exist between military logic and political reality before the gap became untenable. In the weeks following the battle, U.S. commanders quietly adjusted how operations were framed and approved. Large, repeated assaults on heavily defended terrain with no intentions of permanent occupation became harder to justify. Not because they were tactically unsound, but because they were now politically radioactive. The cost of explaining them had begun to outweigh the benefit of conducting them. This shift aligned with broader policy movement in Washington. The administration of Richard Nixon was already pursuing what would become known as Vietnamization, reducing American ground combat while transferring responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. Hamburger Hill did not create that policy, but it gave it urgency and clarity. It provided a concrete example of why continued large-scale U.S. ground fighting was becoming unsustainable. In the military, the lessons were more nuanced. Hamburger Hill was not viewed as a failure of leadership or courage. Those elements were never in doubt. Instead, it was studied as a case where tactical success collided with strategic messaging. The battle had achieved its immediate objective, engaging and inflicting heavy losses on enemy forces, but the method and cost undermined confidence in the larger effort. As a result, emphasis shifted further toward operations that could demonstrate clear, explainable outcomes. Holding ground mattered more if it could be shown to protect populations or deny critical routes. Search and destroy operations did not disappear, but they were increasingly constrained by how they would look once stripped of operational context and presented to a skeptical audience. This represented a subtle but important change. The war was no longer being judged solely by what it accomplished militarily, but by how those accomplishments translated into public understanding. Victory still mattered, so did optics. For soldiers in the field, this change was not always visible day to day. Combat continued, patrols continued, firefights continued, but the appetite for battles like Hamburger Hill, extended, costly, and difficult to explain, diminished sharply. Commanders became more cautious about committing units to terrain that offered no enduring advantage. In the long term, Hamburger Hill became a reference point in professional military education, not as an example of what not to do tactically, but as a warning about misalignment. Wars are fought by armies, but sustained by public consent. When the two drift too far apart, even successful battles can become liabilities. That lesson extended beyond Vietnam. Future conflicts would wrestle with the same problem in different forms. How to apply force decisively without creating moments that erode the legitimacy of its use. Hamburger Hill entered that lineage, not because it was unique, but because it made the issue impossible to ignore. The irony was unavoidable. Hill 937 had been abandoned because it did not matter enough to hold. Yet the battle fought over it mattered enough to change how the war was conducted. It was not the hill that altered policy. It was the realization that the cost of taking it could no longer be explained away. Long after Hill 937 faded from the headlines and briefings, it stayed with the men who had fought there, not as a symbol or a lesson, but as a collection of moments that refused to organize themselves into something neat or reassuring. For many veterans, memory did not return in chronological order. It came back as terrain, the angle of the slope, the feel of the mud under boots, the weight of a wounded man being dragged downhill. It came back as sound, sudden gunfire at close range, shouted warnings, the thump of artillery landing somewhere just out of sight. The hill itself became inseparable from those sensations. What lingered most was not fear, but exhaustion, the kind that seeps in slowly and never quite leaves. Days of climbing, fighting, pulling security, and doing it again without rest compressed time into a blur. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were rushed or skipped. The body learned to function at the edge of depletion because there was no alternative. Many veterans spoke later about the strange emotional flattening that set in. Loss was acknowledged, but there was rarely time to process it. A man was hit, someone else took his place. Movement resumed. Grief was deferred indefinitely, filed away for a moment that never quite arrived. The abandonment of the hill complicated those memories. For some, it sharpened them. The decision to leave made the losses feel heavier, harder to contextualize. It raised questions that had no satisfying answers, not accusations. Most understood the logic, but a persistent sense of imbalance between effort and outcome. Others remembered it differently. They saw the battle as part of a larger pattern, one fight among many in a war defined by movement rather than possession. For them, Hill 937 was brutal, but not unique. What made it stand out later was not the fighting itself, but the attention it received afterward. What united these perspectives was the absence of triumph. No one remembered Hamburger Hill as a victory, even though it was taken, nor did they remember it as a defeat in the traditional sense. It occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, a place where courage and competence were undeniable, but meaning was elusive. Coming home did not resolve that tension. Veterans returned to a country increasingly divided over the war, where explanations often felt simplified or incomplete. Being told what Hamburger Hill represented rarely matched what it had felt like. The hill had not been a statement, it had been a job, one that demanded everything in the moment and offered little clarity afterward. Over time, many veterans came to see Hill 937 less as a question of strategy and more as a reflection of the war itself. Vietnam did not lend itself to clean narratives. It resisted closure. Hamburger Hill fit that pattern perfectly. It was intense, costly, and unresolved in a way that defied easy interpretation. For those who had been there, the hill remained personal, not because of what it proved or changed, but because of who had stood beside them on its slopes. Names mattered more than objectives. Faces mattered more than maps. Hill 937 did not define their service, but it stayed with them as a reminder of what service sometimes demanded, and how little it explained in return. The war moved on. They carried the hill with them. For the North Vietnamese forces defending Hill 937, the battle unfolded according to a very different logic. Victory was not defined by holding ground indefinitely or by dramatic counterattacks. It was defined by endurance, delay, and cost imposed on the enemy. The units dug into the hill had prepared for exactly this kind of fight. The A Shau Valley was familiar ground, the terrain favored defense, and time favored the side willing to absorb punishment without breaking. Bunkers were not meant to stop every assault outright. They were meant to slow it, channel it, and make each advance expensive. From that perspective, the battle worked. The defenders did not need to defeat American forces in a decisive engagement. They needed to hold long enough to inflict casualties and force repeated commitments. Every stalled assault achieved that goal. Every day the fight continued increased the likelihood that the battle would matter beyond the valley itself. When American units finally reached the crest, the defenders did not counterattack in force. They withdrew. This was not a collapse, it was a calculated decision. Once the cost-benefit balance shifted, remaining on the hill no longer served its purpose. The objective had never been symbolic control of Hill 937. It had been to engage the enemy on favorable terms and survive to fight again. From Hanoi's perspective, the outcome was favorable, regardless of who stood on the hill at the end. The battle consumed American attention, manpower, and political capital. It reinforced doubts already growing inside the United States. The subsequent withdrawal from the hill only amplified those effects. Casualties among North Vietnamese forces were significant. Units suffered losses that could not be ignored, but attrition was a currency they were prepared to spend. Replacement pipelines and long-term strategy assumed sacrifice. Time, not territory, was the decisive factor. The battle demonstrated something the North Vietnamese leadership understood well. The United States could win tactically and still lose momentum strategically. Battles like Hamburger Hill exposed that imbalance. They created moments where American success generated questions instead of confidence. Hill 937 fit neatly into that approach. It forced U.S. forces to fight hard for limited gain. It invited scrutiny. It created a narrative that traveled far beyond the jungle. From that standpoint, abandonment of the hill was not a reversal. It was a confirmation. The defenders melted back into the terrain and the broader conflict, carrying lessons forward just as the Americans did. They learned what kinds of pressure the U.S. military would apply, how it coordinated firepower, and where its patience ended. Those lessons would be used elsewhere, on other hills, in other valleys. Hamburger Hill is often remembered as an American story because of its visibility and political impact. But for the North Vietnamese, it was one battle in a long war fought on terms they believed favored persistence over possession. They did not need to hold the hill forever. They only needed to make it matter. And in that sense, Hill 937 served its purpose for both sides, just not in the same way. Hamburger Hill did not change the outcome of the Vietnam War by itself. No single battle ever could. What it did was strip away illusion. On the slopes of Hill 937, nothing failed in the way failure is usually imagined. Orders were followed, units moved when told to move, fire support was available, leadership functioned, courage was constant, and the hill was taken. By every tactical measure, the operation worked. That's what made it so unsettling. The battle revealed a widening gap between what could be accomplished on the battlefield and what could be justified beyond it. Hill 937 demanded enormous effort and exacted a heavy price, yet it produced no lasting point of reference. No ground held, no population secured, no clear marker of progress. It was a victory that required explanation, and explanations were already wearing thin. For the men who fought there, Hamburger Hill was not a metaphor. It was mud, exhaustion, noise, and loss compressed into 10 days that never fully let go. It did not feel symbolic while it was happening. It felt immediate. The meaning came later, imposed from a distance, often by people who had never climbed the hill themselves. That distance mattered. Hamburger Hill became a symbol because it was simple enough to understand and complex enough to argue over. Men fought, men died, the ground was taken, then it was left behind. Everything else, doctrine, strategy, necessity, felt secondary to that sequence of events. In that sense, the hill exposed the war's central problem. Vietnam demanded persistence without offering clarity. It required sacrifice without delivering finality. Battles like Hamburger Hill made those contradictions visible, not through defeat, but through success that failed to satisfy. The jungle reclaimed Hill 937 quickly. Vegetation grew back, bunkers collapsed, the scars faded into the slopes. What did not fade was the question the battle left behind. How much cost could be absorbed before the purpose became too difficult to explain? That question did not belong only to Vietnam. It belongs to every war fought far from home, under conditions where progress is measured in increments and meaning must be defended as carefully as ground. Hamburger Hill endures because it sits at the point where effort, sacrifice, and justification no longer aligned cleanly. It is remembered not because it was unique, but because it was revealing. Hill 937 was taken, then abandoned. What it left behind was harder to walk away from. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.